The suffocating stillness of the forest was shattered by a blood-curdling shriek that pierced through the darkness like a blade. Adrenaline flooded his veins as he broke into a desperate sprint, the monster's thunderous footfalls closing in behind him. This hulking behemoth had haunted their village for centuries, its ghastly wails striking icy terror into their hearts. But never had the ogre ventured this close before. He scrambled over gnarled roots and loose rubble, his chest burning, each gasping breath more labored than the last. The ancient trees around him seemed to writhe with malicious intent, their twisted branches reaching out like bony claws to impede his escape. Shadows danced around him, cast by the pale moonlight trickling through the dense canopy above. They played tricks on his mind, morphing into grotesque shapes and figures, as if the forest itself had come alive to torment him. Risking a glance back, he saw the monster burst through a copse of trees, its hulking frame dwarfing the ancient oaks and pines. Jagged antlers jutted from its ghoulish head, framed by lank strands of hair matted with viscera and grime. Its baleful eye glowed like smoldering embers, alight with predatory hunger as it fixed its gaze upon him. With each thundering footfall, foul ichor dripped from its maw, sizzling as it hit the forest floor. The ogre let loose another chilling roar, the sound reverberating through his chest like a physical force. He pushed himself harder, lungs burning, as he wove between the trees. All he could hear was the frantic pounding of his heart keeping time with the ogre's pursuit. Ahead, the forest opened up into a small glen. He didn't hesitate, sprinting into the open space bathed in moonlight. But as he crossed the threshold, dread knotted his stomach. The glen was a dead end, surrounded on all sides by steep rock walls carpeted in moss. He wheeled around, but it was too late. The ogre stalked out from the tree line, blocking any hope of escape. It let out a guttural chuckle, savoring his terror. Lumbering closer, the foul creature seemed to swell in size, blotting out the moon above. He backed against the sheer rock face, fingers scrabbling over the slick moss. The ogre bared its crooked fangs in a gruesome mockery of a grin as it loomed over him. This was it. After all those years of living in fear, he was face to face with the monster of legend. Just as it reared back to strike, a piercing whistle split the air. The ogre recoiled with a squeal of pain as an arrow sprouted from its shoulder in a spray of viscous black blood. At the edge of the glen, a cloaked figure emerged from the trees, bow drawn and poised to loose another shot. The ogre rounded with an enraged bellow, all thoughts of him forgotten. As it charged the stranger, he seized his chance. Scrambling up the rock face, his fingers clawed into tiny fissures in the moss-slick stone. His arms burned from exertion as he climbed higher, the sounds of the struggle unfolding below. Reaching a small outcrop just out of the ogre's reach, he hauled himself up and collapsed onto the rocky shelf. Far below, the ogre and stranger danced their deadly dance. More arrows peppered the beast, sinking deep into its hideous flesh. It swiped brutishly with curved claws, but the stranger nimbly darted back, loosing arrows in a rhythmic tempo. With a piteous wail, the ogre crashed to its knees, the ground quaking from its colossal weight. The stranger approached slowly, an arrow drawn taut against the bowstring. For a moment, the forest was still, as if holding its breath. Then, with an awful gurgle, the light faded from the ogre's baleful eye as the stranger's arrow pierced deep into its skull. The silence that followed was deafening. Cautiously, he picked his way back down the rock face. His mysterious savior stood over the ogre's corpse, hood drawn back to reveal a woman's face etched with woad beneath a shock of auburn hair. Her piercing eyes fixed him with a questioning look, and for the first time that night, he felt hope stirring within. She held a weathered bearing that marked her as no mere villager. Her leathers and sword marked her as a hunter, experienced in tracking such dangerous quarry. As she studied the remnants of the ogre, he hesitated, then pointed in the direction of his village. If she could fell such a beast, perhaps she could help stop the greater evil that threatened his people. With a nod, She gestured for him to lead the way. The ominous hush of the forest seemed to close in around them as they hiked through the night. Shafts of moonlight pierced the canopy in places, illuminating scattered ruins choked in undergrowth and overgrown paths long forgotten. This wood was ancient, and countless mysteries lay buried beneath the crawling ivy and carpet of fallen leaves. Each shadow hid something deeper, more sinister than he dared contemplate. All the legends rumored this forest to be awakened, the gnarled trees and moss-eaten stones imbued with a watchful presence. Tonight, he felt that presence acutely. Something was stirring, just out of sight, and the unnatural silence rang in his ears. Beside him, the hunter moved with preternatural grace, her footfalls making no sound against the forest floor. Her keen eyes continuously scanned their surroundings, missing nothing. While her presence steadied him, he couldn't ignore the cold sense of dread seething within. She was seasoned, but what awaited them would test her skill beyond anything she had faced before. After what felt like an eternity, they reached the outskirts of the village. Modest, thatched cottages lined a central dirt path illuminated by scattered torches. The entire village was enclosed within a tall palisade wall, yet it felt tragically inadequate against the forces lurking nearby. As they passed through the wooden gates, a few villagers emerged from their homes, their faces etched with worry. He quickly recounted the legend of the ogre, then shared news of its demise. But his tale did not end there. The ogre was but a herald of a greater evil soon to be upon them. He spoke of the village seer's ominous vision foretelling the coming of an ancient one at the next full moon. It would emerge from the shadowed depths of the forest to raise their home and enslave any survivors. The villagers' frightened eyes turned to the hunter, desperate for salvation. Stepping forward, she drew her sword, the steel ringing with anticipation. Her eyes blazed with conviction as she studied the scattered weapons and provisions. There was no time for elaborate plans. She directed the villagers to train their courage and gather their steel. When the enemy came, they would meet them with blood and fury. The following days passed in a blur of preparation. Crude weapons took shape beneath the village blacksmith's hammer. Archery targets sprouted in the fields where villagers practiced under the hunter's tutelage. They sparred and parried as she barked instructions, blossoming into warriors before his eyes. Watchtowers rose at the corners of the palisade, bonfires blazing upon them through the night. He and the hunter pored over ancient maps and scrolls detailing the forest's twisted paths. If the Ancient One gathered its forces, they would meet it head-on before it could reach the village. As the moon swelled toward fullness, a sense of dread permeated the village. But the hunter's tireless efforts had ignited defiance in place of fear. On the eve of the fated night, the villagers gathered weapons and provisions, their faces resolute. Her words had kindled courage within them. Tonight, they made their stand. As the sun dipped below the horizon, they manned the watchtowers and palisade walls. The hunter's bow was strung, sword at the ready. All eyes were trained on the forest's edge. When the attack came, they would be ready. It began with a baleful shriek, rending the stillness, followed by a seething tide of horrors bursting from the trees. They were malformed monstrosities, clawing and crawling over one another in a frenzy to destroy. Barbs and spines tore through their own rotted flesh as they threw themselves against the wooden walls. Arrows pelted their misshapen forms while warriors hacked at grasping talons with steel. Then a hulking silhouette eclipsed the moon, the towering Ancient One come to spearhead the assault. Its skeletal form exuded power, burning points of crimson fire in its skull-like head. When it spoke, the sound was a grating cacophony, commanding the fiends to attack. With renewed frenzy, the horrors clambered over each other, breaching the walls through sheer numbers. Chaos erupted within the village as the creatures poured through. The guttural bellows of the fiends mingled with screams as claws tore into flesh. He slashed desperately, black blood spraying. All seemed lost. Then the hunter was there, carving a path through the horrors with her silver blade singing. Together they battled toward the shattered gates where the Ancient One stooped to enter. This creature was the heart of the evil. If it could be stopped, the rest would fall. It turned its burning gaze upon them and charged, massive fists pounding craters into the earth. At the last second, she dove aside, rolling to regain her feet in a single fluid motion. Her sword lashed out, biting deep into the Ancient One's armored wrist. It reeled, howling. But a savage backhand sent her flying through the wall of a cottage. Before he could react, a colossal hand pinned him down, talons piercing his shoulder. The Ancient One leaned close, its voice a malevolent sneer. But then, her eyes snapped open, blazing with defiance. Grabbing a smoldering length of wood, she drove it into the creature's chest like a spear. Unholy flames erupted outward, racing across its skeletal frame. Even engulfed, it fought on, wicked claws raking the air. But she was relentless, her whirling blade finding every gap as she severed its legs out from under it. The Ancient One thrashed in agony until the purifying fire finally reduced it to cinders. As the creature collapsed, its death cry pierced the once more peaceful night. The remaining horrors melted away in defeat. Though the village was ravaged, the immediate threat had passed. They had endured. Dawn's light spilled across the forest as the villagers gathered around the Ancient One's smoldering remains. Their home was scarred but still standing. The creature's evil had been purged. The hunter's face was somber yet peaceful as she prepared to move on. Evil would always lurk in shadow, she warned. They must stay vigilant and train their children in courage. Her purpose called her elsewhere, but she would come if darkness encroached upon their home again. As she disappeared into the trees, he sent a prayer of thanks. They would rebuild with brave hearts and teach the lessons well. Should shadow rise again, they would not falter, and perhaps someday tales would be woven of the hunter who came from the woods to turn the tide against even the most ancient evil.